Y como os decía antes, pues hacemos un cambio de switch, de paradigma de ya no vamos a hablar un poco de los síntomas, sino que vamos a hablar de nuevas tecnologías, ¿no? Y si os pregunto si habéis escuchado inteligencia artificial, entiendo que todos estáis puestos en ello y la verdad es que es un campo en el que estamos totalmente, digamos, está la ciencia avanzando muy rápido en la inteligencia artificial. Personalmente creo que es importante formarnos en ello y creo que va a ayudar al campo de la neurorrehabilitación, ¿eh? Y bueno, pues creíamos que era un tema que había que tratar en estas jornadas, ¿eh? Para ello tenemos al doctor James Cotton, que es médico rehabilitador y es ingeniero también, ¿eh? Trabaja en el Shirley Ryan de Chicago, que tuvimos la oportunidad de conocer y estar con él allí. Y la verdad que creo que es un profesional que nos puede abrir la mente en relación a la inteligencia artificial y cómo la inteligencia artificial nos puede ayudar a mejorar el proceso de neurorehabilitación. Thank you very much, James. It's a pleasure for us to have you here, and hopefully we can learn a lot about your talk.
We'll see. Thank you very much for having me. It's my first time in Spain. I mean, this is a gorgeous place to be having a conference. It's really exciting for me, both as a clinician and a researcher and an engineer, to be kind of seeing international approaches to neurorehabilitation. So very much enjoy this opportunity. So I'm going to be talking about some of the work I've been doing at Shirley Ryan AbilityLab as well as internationally. I'll just start by briefly mentioning our hospital because I kind of like it. So it's a pretty new building that was built in Chicago a couple of years ago. And what's really exciting about it is it's really focused around the idea of integrating technology and research into clinical practice. And so I'll be talking about a lot of the work I've been doing focused on AI, in particular on gait analysis. It may be another case where we're not quite at the stage where we can really change clinical outcomes, but I'll be happy to have that discussion. And so as a motivation for why I do what I do, as a clinician, how someone walks into my clinic tells me a huge amount about their health status, right? The way they move just informs so much just instantly. But shockingly, we don't measure that, right? And like a large part of what we do in rehabilitation is try and improve movement outcomes. And again, we don't measure that. And you can imagine if a cardiologist only had access to a stopwatch and they just got to measure your pulse, we'd have much worse cardiac outcomes, right? And so that's, in my mind, sort of the state we are in rehabilitation. And the reason we're there is because we just haven't had clinically accessible tools to actually measure and quantify movement, which is why we have so many outcome measures, right? Where we just use a stopwatch and do a whole new thing and then just kind of move on and build more and more outcome measures. And so I'm going to be talking about some of the techniques we've been developing to address this problem. And really, there's going to be a plurality of methods. I'm going to talk about mostly using video, multiple videos or single videos, and then how we can start to try and extract clinically meaningful metrics from that. And so just to start with, do clinicians even think this is a useful idea? So we surveyed a number of our gait therapists at Shirley Ryan AbilityLab and found that the vast majority of them thought that easy access to gait analysis would help them. There were two broad areas where they really thought it would be helpful. One is for longitudinally tracking whether people improved different aspects of their gait that they were being targeted by therapy. The other was to demonstrate to insurance that people are continuing to make progress in their walking quality, even if perhaps they plateaued on some of these timer-based measurements. And so when we try and unpack it further, though, and ask how they would really use this information to directly optimize or alter their therapies, there's a lot less uncertainty or a lot less confidence there. So I really think we've got this problem of a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, but we can come back to that later. So what are our choices in current clinical practice? So on the left, we have a traditional gait laboratory with marker-based methods. People can put EMGs on. You have to step on these particular targets. Produces fantastic data. At least in the US, we only ever really use it clinically when we're considering surgical interventions for, for orthopedic conditions, where we really need that high-quality data. But the hours and the expense it takes to collect it means we're never going to use it in routine clinical practice. On the other hand, as I've alluded to, we have a stopwatch. So there's a big gap between these two. And so now just kind of touching on the neuroscience and thinking about how does movement occur, right? So very high level, someone thinks themselves, perhaps they want to walk quickly and then turn around. And so then the corticospinal tract will start sending fibers down to the spinal cord. That will start modulating the behavior of certain reflex circuits. As a result, we'll get this kind of circular process where that feedback comes back and is in the closed loop control, producing a sequence of muscle activations, but we don't get to see any of that. What we see, someone walking down a hall. Now, if we really do start to analyze how people walk, again, it tells us a lot about their health status. And I won't put anyone on the spot, but if you were to look at this individual, probably the majority of you would think that they do not have a gait impairment, and you'd be correct. In contrast, when you look at this individual, you'll notice that they're advancing their left arm with a cane, spending very little time in single support on their right leg, and this is an individual with a right hemiplegia. This is an individual kind of walking with the converse gait, and they've got a left hemiplegia, maybe a little bit less impaired. They're walking a little bit more quickly. Now, this person, once they get going, you might at first think, oh, they don't have a gait impairment. But then if you start watching their trunk, watching their arm swing, you're going to notice there's a bit of an asymmetry there. This is actually a younger transfemoral amputee who's walking quite well and really engaging that knee unit. And then finally, we have this individual who has a bit more of a symmetrical pattern, right? You can tell that they're using a rolling walker. There's a bit of a scissoring of their gait. They've got some adductor spasticity, and this is an individual with an incomplete spinal cord injury. All right, so now we're going to just talk a little bit about how we kind of collect some of that data. So over the last couple of years, there's been a real explosion of technologies, including multi-view markerless motion capture. On the left, I'm showing a screenshot of a commercially available system called Thea Markerless. There's also free software like OpenCap that can collect some of this data from smartphones. If you're just interested in playing around with this is a very accessible tool, although I would be very cautious in Europe about GDPR details because that data is processed in Stanford. But we wanted to build our own system, partly because when we started, OpenCap didn't exist, but also partly because integrating into our clinical workflows is essential for our goals. And so, this is a screenshot of the acquisition software we developed. Made a nice little web-based front end because most of my engineers didn't want to type Linux commands. You can see it's recording video from my lab. Sorry, the resolution's not great here, but it tracks all the experiments and we can push them to a database. Now, most of our participants need to walk with some degree of assistance from therapists. So one of the first steps we need to do is actually separate who we want to analyze from who's just providing assistance at experiment. So again, a nice little user-friendly dashboard where you can just go in and click. And then finally, we get these kind of biomechanical analyses, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. And so here's just what our system looks like. This is my laboratory. You can see it's kind of creepy surveillance state, covered in cameras. And then we can discreetly integrate these into the clinical floors. So this on the right is the 23rd floor. What floor is your lab on? Yeah, this is right across the street from Jose's lab. You'll hear more about that soon. Since I think this is more of a clinical audience, I'm not going to belabor the math, but just I'm happy to talk about it. I love talking about it. But we have cool new methods that we can really fit biomechanics to this multi-view video. We don't have to do additional steps like scaling the skeleton that are typically involved in marker-based methods. For me, that was essential because most of my participants can't necessarily hit those poses by themselves. And also, we want to just be able to just start collecting data. So here's kind of an example of what we get out of it, right? So here's someone walking down a hall. You can see that overlay that the biomechanics is fitting them pretty well. We can create these other reconstructions to look at it in different ways. We never want to neglect pediatrics, and so we've also been validating on pediatrics. And you can see this individual is actually walking on an instrumented walkway, which allows us to get gold standard data about their spatial temporal gait parameters, which is then what we went and validated the system again. So on the bottom row, you're seeing these errors for the gait parameters, specifically step width, step length, typically around 10 to 15 millimeters across this kind of room scale tracking. This top graph is just showing the methodology we developed outperform some of the more traditional methodologies. So we're quite happy with these approaches to produce high quality data. And so what's nice about this is now we can really use the system that's integrated into the clinic and look at people early and late in their admissions. And here you're seeing someone that at both points in time has a significant gait impairment, but you can clearly tell they're walking a lot more quickly on the right. They've progressed from using a hemi walker to a 4-point cane. And so, yeah, we can now get better quantification of all of these measurements. Similarly, we can break down the gait cycle, and we can really look at the profiles of the asymmetry that this individual with a more mild but still present gait asymmetry has. This is a method that we developed a couple of years ago for breaking down those gait cycles, because one of the things we wanted to was avoid the need for those force plates, which are typically used in marker-based experiments. And so essentially we just used 10,000 videos from our decades worth of clinical gait laboratory to train a system that could go from computer vision to these gait events. And that's how we kind of extracted those waveforms. We've also validated that system out in the real world with smartphone video. And so, for example, if you look at the color of the dots on the ankle, you can see when that foot hits the ground, it changes from green to red. And so we're really excited about these systems to be able to scale in the real world. And I'll come back to some of the monocular smartphone video analysis in a moment. But there's still a lot of challenges with this, right? So as we start collecting data in the clinic, not all data is the same, right? So here's someone working on stepping over obstacles. Here's someone, I have no idea what they're doing. They're kind of walking and then they're turning around. And we do not have the kind of algorithms that can take all this data at scale yet and break down like, okay, this is this therapeutic task, this is this therapeutic task. So this still requires some manual work, as well as just kind of coordinating with the therapists. And right now that requires us to get research staff on the floor. And so using this technology, another problem is we don't necessarily have normative kinematics on all the sorts of tasks that we would want to assess people on in rehabilitation. Now, my dream is that we can get all the information we want from just regular walking. That's probably not the case. And so here is us taking the system to multiple conferences to collect more normative data. And so here is some samples from the functional gait assessment, which is a common measure used in neurologic rehabilitation that can assess balance and stability. And so you can see some people doing diverse tasks like the L test, and then which isn't part of the actual FGA, as well as walking backwards. Here's sort of the whole battery of tasks we did. Just kind of going back to the first talk, cognition and dual tasking I think is really important. So we made sure to throw the cognitive timed up and go in there, as well as the regular timed up and go. And so now we sort of have a normative kinematics for all of this data. Now, you may notice that we also have arms in these videos. And so we wanted to see how well we can track arms. And one of the nice collaborations that came out of doing this is with my colleagues in Switzerland. And they had a bunch of data where they'd been using a smartphone or a multi-camera system. And here you can see basically that our mechanism tracks the arm well. All these waveforms are comparing against marker-based methods. And we see fairly low angular error there. So hopefully that will be out in a preprint soon. But what if we want to go even further? What if we want to get down to the level of the individual hand? And so here we have a system where we have 8 of these cameras around a person, and it's really focused on hand tracking. And what we see is essentially with this system and this kind of closer camera configuration, we have an equivalent spatial error of about 4 to 5 millimeters at each joint within the hand. So this, as far as I know, no one has this level of precision for hand tracking yet. Now, of course, this opens up a whole new world of challenges, like what do we do with this data? What do we break it down? And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So one of my colleagues is also really interested in how supporting the shoulder reduces the reticulospinal drive to the deltoids and then changes arm workspace and then also hand function. So now we can actually use this technology to look at the hand function with this robotic device that, again, is enabling new kinds of research at scalable ways that we're really excited about. Advance, please. Now we can even go further. So there's these newer models that have come out that do the whole body down to the individual hands. And so we first made sure that when we checked our gait parameters, that this more complex high degree of freedom model worked well for us. It did. And what's nice about this is now that we can actually start tracking the whole body, including down to the level of individual hands at room scale during tasks like wheelchair propulsion, right? Now, this is a really important problem because people that use wheelchairs have very high rates of shoulder pathology. They have very high rates of carpal tunnel syndrome. And we haven't really had the technology to look at those kind of kinematics at scale and start to identify the individualized risk factors and to try and do earlier interventions to prevent these essentially like life-altering pathologies and secondary consequences. Similarly, our outcome measures themselves are often not as sensitive as we'd like. At least I say that because I want to make sure some of the interventions that we're developing, we have a little bit more statistical power. And so here you can see someone doing one of the tasks on the capabilities of upper extremity task. And as they're reaching up, as you watch, their tricep will fatigue and they'll go from extending to about 120 and 130 degrees to about 90 degrees, right? And that humerus starts to barely come across above horizontal. So we can really start to pull out more subtle features that indicate things such as, in this individual's case, triceps weakness that we would otherwise not pick up. Now, this is all with our multi-camera system, and we're really excited about that, but it's still not the most scalable technology, right? You need to have multiple cameras set up in a room, a dedicated space. We want to get to where we can actually do a lot of this with even a smartphone. And so a grad student in my lab has been doing a great job on this, essentially extending this technology, this kind of methodology that we've been developing to monocular video, and also taking account that when we're taking videos with a smartphone, we're often rotating the phone to track participants. And this is the result of that system. And so now, even though this looks very similar to the prior videos, this is actually just from a single smartphone. Notice as that phone rotates, the person is tracking correctly in absolute world coordinates. Again, I'm just going to replay it because I'm pretty proud of this. Although I can take very little credit, it's mostly JD. Yeah, so this is working quite well. That top plot is actually comparing the position tracked with our multi-camera system with the position tracked with our single camera system. We're seeing spatial tracking errors of like 5 to 10 centimeters, which is not nothing, but it's still pretty good for just a smartphone. I will caveat this, that if we're walking behind the person, which we often do, then it only tracks their relative spatial offsets, right? So we're working on some advances there, and we'll probably solve that pretty soon. But this is just showing all the different lower extremity joint angles that we track, the hip and the knee, comparing it to our markerless motion capture system, seeing that we typically get about 5 degrees or less of error for all of these joints. There are outliers there, and quality control is really important here, and I'm kind of glossing over that. But in general, it's working quite well. And that set of plots on the right is also showing that it works quite well for diversity of activities. And so what's really nice about this is now, by just installing a smartphone app on, that connects to our cloud infrastructure, we're really enabling a lot easier collaboration. So this video on the left is collected by one of my colleagues in St. Louis, and he is really interested in the effects of cervical decompression for cervical myelopathy on a number of different gait metrics. And so here you can see someone performing tandem walk. On the right, this is a collaboration I have at Northwestern with what's called the Human Longevity Lab that's really interested in looking at aging across multiple organ systems. And I really wanted, as a physiatrist, to focus on function. And so now we can quantify how people move with different tasks. Now, one of the findings that came out of that paper from JD was that we really originally wanted to figure out how to best fuse the wearable sensors that we developed, that we collect with our smartphone platform, with the video data we get from our smartphones. The conclusion was that the video does really well, and I spent years of my life developing sensors which don't add any value. Whoops. Although I will caveat that if we actually have the sensors and the videos occluded, then we can track really well. And so in my mind, this just speaks to the fact that sensors and video are complementary. Like if I can get a video on someone, that's what I want. But a lot of times when people are out in the real world, we really need to be able to measure what they're doing as well, because it's the real world that we're actually ultimately trying to change function in. And so here, for example, are some of the wearable sensors we created compared to a quarter, which now I think about it probably doesn't help you guys very much, but it's about yay big. And for example, this system here is designed to mount on the shank of a prosthesis so that we can actually do all of our functional assessments in lab with video and kinematic analysis, and then track every step individuals take out in the community so we can account for how much they walk. And then if we add GPS, we could track if they're moving around in the community, right, and getting out of their home. And then critically also, this population falls at incredibly high rates. So we can track if they fall, we can track the kinematics of the fall. We can see in the context, did they fall during a long bout of regular stable walking, or did they fall right at the beginning when they got up and they had to they didn't stabilize? And then maybe that will relate to the timed up and go, but the stumbles on a long walk will relate to toe clearance, for example, which might require more of a prosthetic adjustment. Again, sensors can add a lot of value. And so here, this was a clinician-driven project that I was really excited about. we have this mechanism where clinicians can actually come up with an idea, submit for funding, and get it. And so Anna, one of our physical therapists, really wanted to look at muscle activation patterns in her individuals with chronic stroke. And so here you can see this individual walking. They've got a moderate gait impairment. You can maybe see that there's some sensors on their left leg. And so here's the muscle activity from the tibialis anterior, the soleus, the rec fem, the lateral hamstring for each individual gait cycle, which was detected by our computer vision algorithm. We can kind of take this average over the gait cycle, and now we get sort of like a profile of this individual's walking. And I want to compare that profile to this individual's walking, who visually has a much slower gait. They got less kind of joint coordination going on. If you look at that EMG, it's more variable. And if we look at this average profile, it's also a lot more correlated across the muscles than this first individual who has these nice sharp bands of different muscle activation. So again, this is giving us the ability to delve into what's going on with people at an even deeper level than we ever could before. Okay, so now I'm going to go a little bit deeper further. So we also want to be able to measure kinetics, right? We want to measure the torques that people are producing. Ultimately, we want to measure even the muscle activation. And so, okay, so we can kind of extend this methodology I described earlier, and we can run little mini physics simulations in this like very powerful, fast physics simulator, and try and use that to figure out what would the torques have been that would actually reproduce that sequence. Again, happy to take questions on the methodology, but the end result is we get something like this. So in this individual, you're looking at this is an individual with a history of stroke at admission, and then right before discharge. And visually, of course, you're going to note that they are now taking faster steps. They are walking with a higher velocity. If you look at their right knee, you can see it's become much more fluid in terms of the amount of flexion. We capture that in these plots up here, right? So here's the knee kinematics before versus this red plot here shows a great deal more knee flexion. But what's even more interesting, if you look at the red plot of the knee torque, you can see that at first they just had a classic stiff knee gait. There's essentially a passive extension moment from that quadriceps when they're in stance phase. But later on, you can see they still have that extension moment, but then they also have a flexion moment, and that's causing their knee to bend. Similarly, when we go look at what's happening at the hip, you can see that at first there's not a lot of modulation of the torque at their paretic hip, but a little bit later, we actually see that those torques look a lot more symmetrical and a lot larger. And so again, this is giving us deeper ways to go. I won't belabor this point, but we can also develop methods similar to this for smartphone video, right? Where we can't necessarily get all the optimization I just described. And so what we can train a system to do is copy walking patterns in a physics simulator. And again, figure out what forces would be required to copy those. And this is trained over the large amounts of data we've got. This is when we first developed it on our clinical gait laboratory, where we saw that we could reproduce a lot of these gait patterns. So for example, there's a crouch knee gait. That top one's a little less impaired. And what we found is adding this physics simulation into our smartphone analysis really improved some of our gait analysis results. And then more recently, we've been replicating this with these more realistic biomechanical models. And so here you can see we're actually getting ground reaction forces and torques, but this is still kind of early work in progress. And so I think we'll have a plurality of methods available to us depending on the type of data we're collecting for how to actually improve things. Okay, so all of this methodology is enabling big rehabilitation data sets. And I love this video. This is just showing a bunch of people doing a bunch of activities, different kinds of levels of impairments. But I'm a clinician too, right? And so I started developing a lot of these technologies because people, leaders in the field were saying, hey, we need to be able to measure gait impairments, movement impairments. I was like, that makes sense. Spend a couple of years, get all the technology working, and then I go back to the papers and be, okay, why did we do this? Like, how does anyone get better? I can't find much, right? As I said, there's this chicken and the egg problem with clinicians who aren't used to working with this data. They certainly don't want to see every joint waveform. They don't want to stare at a lot of those videos. We need to be able to reduce this to the set of data that gives rise to actionable information. And so the way I've been thinking about this is we put together in a recent paper, and we call this the causal framework for precision rehabilitation. If you're interested, please check it out. If you hate it, please tell me why. I really want this to be kind of a paper that stimulates some discussion, because I think this is what is going to be required to go from big data, big clinical data sets to really how do we give those personalized interventions we were talking about earlier, right? How do we give these precise interventions? And so within this framework, it builds on this one paper that I really liked called Computational Neurorehabilitation, which took seriously the idea that we should quantitatively model how people recover, model plasticity. But I don't think it went far enough. It didn't really spend a lot of time linking between impairments in body structure and function and participation, right? These two spectrums of the International Classification of Functioning that is so important. And the other thing we really focus on adding to that prior work is this field of causal inference, right? And if you're interested in this field, the Book of Why by Udaya Pearl is a fantastic, like very accessible and entertaining approach, like introduction to this. And he's kind of one of the godfathers in this field. And so what does this framework look like? Well, as I said, it takes seriously the idea that we can model recovery, right? But we need to actually build mechanistic models. And like in the prior talk, right, when we heard we kind of look at the level of function, look at the level of mechanisms. Again, we need to build these kind of causal models at the level of mechanisms or whatever is the right abstraction for our data, and then make sure it predicts the things we care about, like real world function. If we can then build these causal models, these then become targets in which we can do in silico experiments using them as digital twins of patients and work out what would be the hypothetical rehabilitation intervention that would maximize someone's outcome. So let me unpack that a little bit more. So these models, they need to really include spontaneous recovery. They need to include the influence of our interventions, right? And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. Another thing that was a little counterintuitive to me is, right, we've got to build models of individuals, and then what we measure of those individuals are all of the data we collect, right? And so I think a lot of frameworks will talk about impairment influencing activities, but it's not. The body influences impairments. The body influences participation. So our models need to have that kind of structure. And then finally, we need to be able to fit these to longitudinal data sets and optimize those for long-term function. And so just thinking about the kind of data sets that we collect in rehabilitation, right? So we've got all of these medical biomarkers, we've got imaging, we've got serums, we've got omics, we've got physiology, right? We have all of that. We have all these rehabilitation biomarkers too, right? Our traditional clinical outcomes assessments. We have measurements of movement with advanced sensing. We have neuropsychology. I think also essentially we have patient-reported outcomes, right? We need to understand if these things matter to individuals. So having all of these data is essential. And these are a snapshot in an individual at one moment in time, right? And then whether it's through our standard practice, which for better or worse, we don't have the most solid evidence base of what we do. So worldwide, there's a lot of heterogeneity in what we do. That's actually a source of power for these statistical models. But so whether it's standard practice or intentional clinical trials or this ODTR, which I'll come to in a moment, we select the interventions we do, right? And then as a result, someone has an updated health condition and we get a bunch more measurements. Now, I mentioned that we need to know what the interventions we did are, and this is another problem in our field. Every time the Cochrane Reviews tries to do a meta-analysis of rehabilitation interventions, their large takeaway is no one documented what they did, even if like the point of the paper was what they did, right? So like we do not, and certainly in clinical practice, I know at our organization at least, we do not document with a level of granularity that we would need to build these kind of next generation models. One place where I think there's a lot of promise is this RTSS, or the Rehabilitation Treatment Specification System. This is a framework that suggests documenting a sort of tripartite structure that includes the active ingredients, like the set of things you added into that therapy intervention that you think will improve outcomes. You have the targets of your interventions, whether those are step length asymmetry or motivation or whatever it is, right? And then you have their hypothesized mechanism of action. So finally, so if we add that, we can now get these longitudinal data sets of, impairment, real world participation, interventions we did. And then finally, we can then go and learn something called the optimal dynamic treatment regime, right? So this is learned on these causal models, which I'll give you an example of in just a moment, to figure out, based on this set of data from that health condition, what is the optimal intervention to maximize that long-term participation. And I think that's where rehabilitation is totally different than other medical fields, right? We don't want to just improve impairment for its own sake, right? We don't want to reduce spasticity just to treat ourselves, right? We do it to reduce pain or whatever our particular goals are. And so then finally, and this is a busy slide, but this is an example of what one of these causal models might look like, right? And everyone's going to have their own pet things they wish were on there. So this just kind of speaks to that there's a whole space of potential models depending on the questions you're asking. So for example, we've got the brain, right? And it wants someone to walk. So you've got corticospinal tracts, but you also have the reticulospinal tract. And Jules DeWald, who I mentioned earlier, right, really believes that if these become overactivated, we have an increase in spasticity, we have an increase in synergy. And so we really need to reduce the activation of those and increase the activation of those. And then of course we have the lesion, which is modulating all this activity. And then those are going to change the spinal reflex circuits. That's going to change the muscle activity, which we could then measure with isometric torques or with EMG, or we can look at how they're walking, and we can do that with computer vision, or we can do that with our traditional clinical outcomes assessments. And all of this is going to feed back with spasticity, which I'm not very well modeling in this particular diagram, but would be a clear treatment target. And then we have our interventions. So for example, we tend to do a lot of high intensity gait training for our individuals with stroke, right? So we can do that. We can measure the repetitions. We can measure their heart rate. We've done some work with functional electrical stimulation in the inpatient unit, where we try and the mechanism thought to be paired stimulation that drives an improvement in the muscle control. Or we can give someone an AFO. So we can build whatever models we want and start to unpack that, right? And so, for example, one of my colleagues, Daniel Halfey, and I are really looking into building more biomechanical models of how someone moves at the level of muscle activations, right? So he's an expert in building these spinal reflex circuits, but obviously those are modulated by brain activity. And so we can build these kind of like neurorealistic models. There's some great work now happening in the mouse field, and this is a place where I've been super excited to see the animal research, because my PhD is in neuroscience, so I have like a longing for neuroscience research. And so I'm really excited to see now these biomechanists in animal research, and like Mackenzie Mathis had this great paper recently, building a real like neuromimetic model of the cortex and then fitting it to some biomechanics muscle activations of her rats or mice. Okay, but obviously, this is a big framework or big project. We're going to need a lot of interdisciplinary development. Half the reason I wrote the paper is kind of a call to action for causal researchers out there to come join our community and help us develop it. And then hopefully, with some of the technologies I showed at the beginning of the talk that can measure movement, we can then start to learn, hey, an individual moves this way, we should give them FES, right? Or an individual moves this way, we should give them multi-channel FES or AFOs or whatever interventions, right? And not just that we'll do it because it will make a little bit of an improvement that's statistically significant, but that it will actually improve their real world function, as opposed to other interventions where maybe the model says it won't improve real world function. So we know as a research community, we need to optimize that intervention further. And so I spoke quickly, but hope you don't mind us getting back on schedule, and thanks to everyone that supported this work and the funding.
Thank you, James. Turno de preguntas.
So I need this.
Okay, so I have some questions because I guess that you try to send the idea that we are not really at the point where we can give recommendations now. I mean, we or you have a lot of data,
yep.
And you have to study and to learn how to use that data. That's true?
That's how I feel about it. And additionally, when I've talked to a lot of clinicians and tried to say, hey, I can do this, right? I can get you this data. How would you use it? And I'm really excited and expect them to be like, yeah. They're like, I'm fine. Like, I got my eyes. I know what to do. And so that's where, I hope they would drive that boat, but that's not happening. So now I'm thinking we need to develop these frameworks to maybe help feed that back.
And your perception is that this data is going to change the stroke movement rehab?
I do. I mean, so like so I think there's a lot of places where high quality movement data can inform care. So for example, the trailing limb angle and the amount of push-off force and the parodic propulsion ratio has been shown to indicate whether someone is more likely or less likely to respond to certain fast functional electrical stimulation protocols. So that's just like one particular example where, okay, someone that walks like this is thought to respond to particular interventions. I think we need to be able to do that for more and more classes, right? And I suspect once we have these big data sets, we'll identify there are subgroups that should be treated differently. There's at least in the US right now, there's the discrepancy or a point of controversy around, because of the time in rehabilitation becoming more and more limited, we tend to focus on treating people at the level of function, right? We need to get them functional enough to discharge them home safely. Now, Jules's big hypothesis is by doing that and pushing people too hard too early, we actually drive too much plasticity of the reticulospinal system. And as a result, we actually worsen their long-term impairment. Now, we need to be able to identify, are there some people that maybe we need to go a little bit more gently and then actually get a better long-term function versus other people where going gently would still never get their arm functional. So we should be thinking, how do we give them the right kind of compensation or support to maximize their function through different mechanisms?
And do you think that this data can help us to know when we have to stop the rehab process?
Ooh. I don't want to answer that because I feel like I'd be a bad clinician to say we ever stop the rehab process, right? Because I mean, I think, you know, at least for my patients, right, everyone occasionally needs a tune-up, right? So like their connection to the rehabilitation community should never end, right? But we do sometimes need to change the goals. We do sometimes need to change the intensity. We do sometimes need to encourage people to be living their lives, right? And I think it could be a really tricky thing to balance, right? You don't want to give someone guidance that if you work really hard, you can totally change this impairment and it's all on you, right? Because some people, that's just unfortunately not in the cards of the rehabilitation technologies we have. So the right kind of counseling is just humane, right?
Okay, and because, and I think this, your talk has shown exactly what I'm going to say, is when I think about this data, I have like 2 or 3 concerns. The first is, of course, we need data, and data is important. So I don't know if, because you can be sure that how you collect your data, but that doesn't mean that if we have the same approach here, if we are going to collect the same way the data, so probably the data could be, we are going to analyze together, but it's not going to be the same. This is one of my concerns.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is that as neurologists, we always try to understand everything. And from my point of view, we can't do that. I mean, when you show the mathematics, it's like, this is crazy. I can't understand this. So I have to trust you and the engineering, how they develop. And I have to assume that is true, what you are presenting. Not true. I mean, that I have to trust in your algorithms or whatever.
Right.
And for me, that is, I don't feel comfortable with that because it's like I'm losing part of the process. And the third is my third concern is if we don't, if this new approach is going to be, if we are going to have bias, because we are having just, I mean, I don't know if in low income countries, if they have data, and I don't know if they have the same access to this kind of technology, and we are going to give recommendation from here to here.
All of these are fantastic points. So to the first about sort of data heterogeneity, I think one of the strengths of the causal framework is the different elements in it, because they're causal statements about the world, they are isolated hypotheses, right? And so the right kind of data you can kind of plug in and combine. So to some degree, heterogeneity is going to be a strength, right? And that's why I was making the point that even the differences in how we treat across the world will provide important evidence to control for this, right? There's some aspects of data collection that are essential. Like I was meeting with some colleagues the other day after I gave a similar talk, and they were like very excited me to use my algorithms to study their data in knee arthritis. And I was like, okay, just let's start by you showing me a video. And immediately I'm getting a video of like from the legs down, from the pelvis down. And like, we just don't have the same quality pose estimation algorithms for lower halves as we do for whole bodies, right? So there's some sort of minimum requirements for the data collection. That being said, I think once we get past those, then the algorithms are getting better and better. to where we'll be able to make something out of it. But then the other piece is, what is that missing piece of information that you don't have? So a thing that actually like I worry a lot about is we do a lot of trials where we ask someone to walk at their self-selected speed, fast speed, or slow speed, right? And my dream is to extract as much information of someone's neuromuscular system as possible from gait analysis. And I don't think I'll ever figure out what was the words I whispered at that person that planted in their head that totally changed their behavioral phenotype, right? But like that is the same individual and they have the same neuromuscular capacity. So there's a lot of details there, and I showed those examples of all the different therapeutic tasks, and it's even worse when we go into the outpatient clinic, right? And people are like doing ladder drills, and so figuring out how to make sense of all that data is going to be a real challenge. But at the same time, there are protocols that we could standardize, like overground walking with video from behind. Like that's a way we do most of our work, and most places could do that. And then we can disseminate algorithms, and we're spending a lot of work trying to make our algorithms easier and easier for other people to use. So that was the first point. And then, and about trusting the math. So there, and we're working on a paper that came out of a summer workshop on precision rehabilitation. And the theme around that is collaborative AI, right? So we don't want the AIs to tell us what to do, right? We want to be working with the AIs as a team to improve outcomes. And in fact, actually, after Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess, there was this period of time where the best chess players in the world were human-computer teams, right? And they were called centaurs, which I just love that term. So I think we need to create like treatment centaurs, right? Where we're using the AI to extract information from how people move. I didn't put it in here because I thought I would run out of time, which was ironic. But I think there's a whole other thing we could talk about where language models are going to help us, right? Whether it's analyzing people's speech patterns and like extracting information about cognition, right? Or going through the medical record and making sure details aren't missed, right? So many people get mistreated, at least in the US, because like information doesn't get transferred. So these are all going to be tools. But then as let's say this causal framework starts to predict this is how you should treat someone, there's going to be a human in that loop. So first of all, they could say like, that is so antithetical to everything I believe, like I'm just ignoring it, right? And then at the next stage, we could say, well, we're going to perform a randomized controlled trial using this AI as an assistant to suggest interventions and seeing if it helps, right? Still not saying anyone has to believe it. Then we can do a kind of a post hoc analysis and see, did the people where maybe they trusted it more like actually have better outcomes? So trustworthiness in AI is a huge issue that's going to be happening. And then that kind of couples into bias, right? And so I didn't show it here, but for example, with so there's a big issue with AI fairness for people with disabilities that's like barely talked about, right? People in AI are aware of bias, but not thinking about people with disabilities. And people with disabilities are massively underrepresented in data sets. And so these systems perform the most poorly for the people that they could potentially help the most. And even just as a case example of that, in that prosthesis work I showed you, we found that the more bilateral and the more proximal people's amputations, the more likely the computer vision would fail, right? It's not shocking. Their limbs looked more different than the able-bodied limbs, but it was a profound problem. Another one was that children with cerebral palsy, if you gave them a rolling walker, some of the algorithms, it doubles the chances they fail to see a child. Now that could have a big implication if that's in a self-driving car, right? So like these things really do matter. And I do think also, the representation of different healthcare systems and things like that will be important data. And then also, I mean, I didn't put in there enough, right? But like the social determinants of health, I mean, like that explains more variance than almost anything, at least in my clinical experience, right? Like there are people I see who I'm like, I can get you home in one case, right? And in another case, I'm like, I can't get you out of a nursing home. And it's 100% social determinants of health and nothing about my medical technology. So.
Preguntas? So I can continue asking. Because one of my points is that I don't know if we in the future, if we are going to be pushed to make the brain work faster than it can, just in order of data. I don't know. I mean, under my point of view, the brain has his time. He needs time to recover, and he needs. But the system is saying us, you have to put the patient at home as soon as you can.
Right.
And that could be very difficult to deal with, especially if we have data that said, this data says that you can go home. Why? Because you walk 2 steps or whatever. And for me, that could be very difficult because, and it's very, I feel comfortable because I know that there are people like you that are combining the treatment of the patients and the data, not only the data, because probably, I mean, you have both sides, medical doctor and engineering, but if you are engineering, you trust data, you don't trust the science. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, not that last part, because for me, they're unified, but I do think there's a massive tension between the, reducing time to discharge and like focusing on just like safely getting people home and maximizing long-term function. And that's where I hope this causal framework might allow us to use data for even, let's say there's just like patients, I mean, the US, like insurance makes a big difference in our treatment strategies too. So we have some patients where we keep them longer for different reasons, right? And then we could start to analyze that and say, what does this matter for long-term function? I think the other point is the data can then start to guide how we should treat people when they go home, right? And I know there's going to be some sessions on telehealth, but like just since you kind of set me up, like another line of work in my lab is on EMG-based biofeedback, right? So we've got these games, people can play them with wearable sensors on their legs, they kind of like bring that hammer up. And so what we find is these allow us to get really large doses of therapy from people. We can even send them home. The audio is not set up, but like in these next videos, like he's giving testimonials about how he can kind of like start to move parts of his muscles. But also like this is when I started really thinking about this framework, right? Because these games are at the level where in my clinical trials, they're making very small differences, right? But I think there's room to optimize it. I needed a modeling framework to sort of be able to predict if I run this long enough and I get this much strength recovery, at what point will he, gain enough tricep strength to be able to do a popover transfer, right? Or things that matter to them. And then, like, again, we need to then figure out when do we need to optimize it. So now we're adding spinal cord stimulation to this because we have this one intervention that we think increases the rate of neuroplasticity, but we know is dependent on dosage. And I have a technology that gives tons of dosage, right? But there is still that concern that I referred to about my colleagues that if you over push a certain type of therapy early on, you might cause some kind of plasticity that is problematic. Then again, maybe we use TMS of the PFC and we can disinhibit that kind of plasticity in selected periods of time. So I think we're gonna have to really just keep layering on different kinds of technologies and tools to try and overcome this I would love to live in a world where we gave people more rehab time, right? But I'm living in a world that's in the US going downhill fast, so.
Hi, thank you, James. I have a question because I have a problem in my mind because we live with a very different health system. In my opinion, you have a very expensive lab, and we can have this kind of lab here in the National Health Service. So, my question is, in the future, do you think that we have a cheap labs or more simple labs that give us the enough data to analyze the gait and improve of the kind of because I don't think that nanotechnology on a smartphone or this kind of technology could have the data to analyze and to help us to have more information to improve the patients. I don't know.
You do not think the smartphone could?
Sorry?
You're saying you do not think the smartphone could produce good enough data to be helpful?
So my question is because you show us a lab with a lot of cams.
Yeah.
And one with just one cam, and you tell us that you can have more information with or good information, but you need sensors and you need an space and you need the help. I agree with Dr. Murray, the help of an engineer to interpretize the data. So you need a person, you need technology, you need a space, you need a lot of things and very expensive things. So I don't know the future. In the future, we can have a cheap way to analyze, to have this data?
So essentially, the underlying goal of my lab is to make technologies that are so affordable that they are scalable and effective, right? So like, I believe that we can do it, right? I mean, so the only reason I built the multi-camera system is because I needed to prove that the single camera system worked, right? And then produce the data to make it work better. And I'm a clinician, right? So I want things that are quick and easy to use in the clinic. And so much of technology, and that, you know, and I have a lot of engineering colleagues and friends, so much of the technology they make is a beautifully built solution to a problem no one ever had, right? And it doesn't help anyone, and it makes you really sad for the whole community that even happened. And so everything I design is like, what is this going to look like in real world deployment, right? So that video here, this is just a smartphone, right? Like, that's all it takes. We can get that now from that. Similarly, we're getting close to getting hands from just a smartphone, right? So like, we're always pushing to how to get that to the more accessible technology. That EMG-based biofeedback system I showed you, the sensors cost about $80. And the reason I built my own sensors was because back when I started, I could buy commercially available. Well, I couldn't because I was a resident, I had no money. But in theory, I could have bought sensors that cost $1,000 and then require a base station and then plug into a computer. And I'm like, no one is going to deploy that in clinical practice, right? So I built my own sensors that work over Bluetooth that could be played by a smartphone or a tablet, because that was the only way I could envision it actually working in clinical practice. Now, there are still technology transfer hurdles to getting those sensors available and with all the regulatory approvals. Actually, back in the day, I used to do some design of drone control systems for flying drones before you could buy them. And one of the funnest things was I just gave the design to a guy in China. I could buy it cheaper with no regulations. And so like, one of my sketchy dreams is to do that with the wearable sensors and biofeedback. But setting that aside, I think we can get these technologies affordable. I think we can get them out there in the real world. I think in my mind, the hardest thing right now is what to do with that data, right? So like, we probably by the end of the year, will have it so you can upload a video to a web page and you'll get something like this out of it, right? Then what, right? Like, no one knows how to use that data to give the right kind of intervention to people. And so that's kind of the driving question now for the lab, is like, how do we, and the other thing we're trying to do is, I think there's going to be an opportunity for a virtuous cycle, right? So like, once we can get it to where therapists can easily apply this, and we're trying to automate the 10-meter walk test, for example, right? So if we can get it to where a clinician can easily get the 10-meter walk test when they're doing this outcome measure they have to otherwise do, that they can get a full 3D gait analysis, and then we can make a nice little dashboard that just has a handful of statistics. Then if we make it easy enough and for them to get to that data and they start looking at it, they might start to say, hey, that's actually quite useful to us now. I'm seeing people change the things I wanted to, right? So I think this is kind of flywheel we need to bootstrap, where we get some of this data, not all of the data, the right probable pieces, into the hands of clinicians, who then tell us that's helpful, that's not helpful, I'm not seeing the changes, right? And then we're gonna get more buy-in for the clinicians to actually like be a little intentional about, hey, I'm gonna go do my 10-meter walk test there because I get this gait analysis and I like it. That's then also gonna produce the data I need for this precision rehabilitation framework. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. But, you know, I mean, they may also start getting it. They're like, I hate this. I'd rather just look with my eyes and I trust my memory. The other way I'm hoping to get buy-in is if we can just produce, like, automatically insert that information into their documentation, and it's one less thing they have to do. Like, again, this is the way I think about the kind of clinical translation. Like, every technology should actually make a clinician's job easier, not harder, right? I mean, the moment you ask, hey, it's only 5 minutes, is the moment you've lost them, right? And, you know, again, I didn't talk about language models, but like, I think one of the places that people are the most excited are these ambient listening experiences, right? Where you just talk to your patient and it auto-generates your note, and you both like get to read off on that. Your experiences are all more human. I think we need technologies like that in medicine, and we need to be building them with that perspective.
Okay, thank you, James, for this wonderful talk.